So it's a pleasure this afternoon to welcome Dr. David Glass to come to speak to us. David is Senior Lecturer in the School of Computing and Mathematics at Ulster University. He has a background, a BSc in Mathematics and an MA in Philosophy and a PhD in Theoretical Physics from Queen's Belfast, where he also did his postdoctoral work. He joined the University of Ulster in 2000. He has a variety of research interests and projects covering Bayesian and explanatory reasoning, knowledge discovery, mathematics, and computer modeling of complex systems. It's multidisciplinary work, and he's published a number of things based on that. On the table we have outside one copy, so you can be first to get that if you're quick, of Atheism's New Clothes, an IVP publication from 2012. So he's done a lot of work on the question of explaining away and design, and it's a privilege to ask him to come and talk to us this afternoon on science, God, and Occam's razor. Can science explain God away? David.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be with you in Cambridge today. And what I'd like to do in this talk is to revisit the idea that there is or could be a conflict of some kind between science and religion. And in particular, I'll focus on science and theism. Now, some of you will rightly point out that in terms of the idea that there's an ongoing and inevitable conflict between science and religion, this has been dead in the scholarly literature for some time. But it's also very much alive and well at a popular level. As we see from many books and articles and every internet discussion, you will see that there is this ongoing perception of a conflict. Furthermore, in some particular areas, in the academic literature, the idea of a conflict is still very much a live option. I think here, for example, of the cognitive science of religion as perhaps the most obvious example. And so what I am going to do today is to hope that by looking at a new approach, it will be able to shed some light on old problems and potentially some new ones as well. The framework that I want to look at concerns an account of the nature of explaining away. And so what I want to do is to address the problem in two different dimensions. First of all, how can we make sense of this ongoing perception of a conflict? And in particular, what's the nature of this conflict supposed to be? And what I'm going to argue is that a way to make sense of this is in terms of the nature of explaining away arguments. And then secondly, in light of that, how can we respond to these explaining away arguments? If my approach has any merit to it, I hope that it will be able to show precisely where these kinds of explaining away arguments go wrong. And I also hope that it will show that this approach that I'm adopting will be applicable to a whole range of topics in the dialogue between science and religion. That at any rate is what I'm hoping to achieve. Now I should point out at this stage that what I'm saying is not completely new, of course. Needless to say, not everything that has been written on the science and religion dialogue before today's seminar has been mistaken, of course not. What's new about my talk today is more about the framework that I'm proposing for addressing these. So the first question that I want to look at is the nature of this alleged conflict. What exactly is it supposed to be? Now, the first thing that I want to say is that it's not one of incompatibility between science and religion. From my reading of the atheist literature over the years, I've discovered that actually, perhaps surprisingly, nobody thinks that. Nobody thinks that they are incompatible in the sense that accepting one rules out the other. I mean, think of the forthcoming referendum. If you vote to remain, that excludes voting to leave. Doing one, the two are mutually exclusive. Doing one excludes the other. Of course, there is another option, and that is you might vote for neither, and on the basis of some of the arguments we're hearing put forward on both sides, that might be a tempting option for some, but you get the idea. One excludes the other. Now, even the new atheists, it turns out, don't think that they are logically incompatible in that sense. This is why I was very intrigued when I came across the book Faith versus Fact by Jerry Coyne. Now, some of you might have come across Jerry Coyne. He's an evolutionary biologist in the United States. He takes an approach to these issues that is very similar to that of the new atheists, very outspoken in his criticisms of religious belief. What intrigued me about his book was the subtitle. I'm not sure if you'll be able to make it out there, but it says, "Why Science and Religion Are Incompatible." And so I thought, could I finally have found someone who is really arguing that they are, strictly speaking, incompatible? But I was quickly disappointed. When I went to his account of incompatibility, he writes, "I don't mean logical incompatibility. That's clearly wrong. For in principle there could be both science and a God to be worshipped." Indeed, Coyne has some difficulty spelling out exactly what this incompatibility does amount to. He says that it's not a practical incompatibility either, and eventually what he points to are differences. Differences in methods, differences in philosophy, and differences in outcome. Now, of course, we all knew there were differences, but even Coyne recognises that the differences don't amount to a logical incompatibility, that accepting one rules out the other. Let's turn then to Richard Dawkins. In The God Delusion, he writes that historically religion aspired to explain our own existence and the nature of the universe in which we find ourselves. In this role, it is now completely superseded by science. Now note here that he's not telling us that science, accepting science, somehow disproves religion or disproves the existence of God. Rather, it replaces it. It supersedes it. The idea is that science has made religion redundant. Now, if you think it's just the new atheists who adopt this kind of viewpoint, it's not. Here's Sean Carroll. He's a cosmologist in the States, and he strikes, I think, a rather more moderate tone than the new atheists. But he has written that over the past few hundred years, the progress of science has worked to strip away God's roles in the world. He isn't needed to keep things moving or to develop the complexity of living creatures or to account for the existence of the universe. 2,000 years ago, it was perfectly reasonable to invoke God as an explanation for natural phenomena. Now we can do much better. Now, furthermore, it's not just modern science. It's not the developments that have taken place in the last few hundred years in science that have given rise to this objection. We actually find it if we go back to Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. In it, just before he presents his famous 5 ways for the existence of God, he outlines 2 objections to belief in God. The first of these is a version of the problem of evil, and the second one is this one. He writes, "Furthermore, it is superfluous to suppose that what can be accounted for by a few principles has been produced by many. But it seems that everything we see in the world can be accounted for by other principles, supposing God did not exist. For all natural things can be reduced to one principle, which is nature, and all voluntary things can be reduced to one principle, which is human reason or will. Therefore, there is no need to suppose God's existence." So God is rendered superfluous, or redundant, an unnecessary hypothesis, or as I shall put it, God's existence is explained away. Now, Aquinas does, of course, respond to it, but I think it's interesting that here we have, as one of 2 objections that he raises to the existence of God, this one, from other explanations. And so I think it's important that we revisit this question as to what our response should be in each generation. Well, let's go to another medieval philosopher, William of Ockham. And of course, Ockham's razor is attributed to him. This is the idea that entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity. That actual phrase is not found in his writings, but one that is the idea that it is futile to do with more things that which can be done with fewer. Now, there's a lot that could be said about Occam's razor. And what I want to do is to look at a particular version of it that will be relevant for the talk today. And it's an explaining away version. The idea is that there is no need for two explanations when one will do. Now, what I propose to do is to look at the nature of Occam's razor. Occam's razor is a very valid principle. Like any razor, it can be an extremely useful tool. But of course, also like any razor, if you use it inappropriately, it can become a very dangerous instrument. And that's what I would suggest happens in the work of the new atheists and others who seek to use it to shave away the God hypothesis. So how does the argument go? Well, let's try to set it out in logical form. Science and theism provide potential explanations for X. Now, X is there to represent various features of the natural world. Premise 2. There is no need for two explanations, science and theism, for X if one will do, if science will explain it on its own. So this is the appeal to Occam's razor. Premise 3. There are good reasons to accept the scientific explanation for X. Conclusion. Therefore, there is no need for theism to explain X. Now, what can we say about this argument? Well, first of all, I hope you can see the attraction of this argument, especially to a scientifically minded atheist. After all, what it's doing, in premise 3 there, it's appealing to the success of science. There are good reasons to accept science. And in premise 2, that there's no need for two explanations if one will do an appeal to Occam's razor. So this might give the impression that this provides a sort of scientific argument against the existence of God, a way of circumventing all that difficult, tricky philosophy and getting straight with science, sort of hitting a home run to there being no God. Of course, I'm going to argue that that's not the case at all. How might we respond to it? Well, immediately you can see three premises, and so three ways of responding to the argument. One is to say that theism doesn't provide an explanation for features of the natural world, and so we'll deny premise 1. We'll talk about that later. Premise 3, that there are good reasons to accept scientific explanations. Well, if you rejected that, but I'm certainly not going to come to the Faraday Institute and recommend that we reject premise 3. So, of course, it's premise 2 that I'm going to focus on. It's this application of Occam's razor. Now, a further thing to note about this argument is that it doesn't show that there's no God. What it shows is that God isn't needed for explaining X. So, somebody could accept this argument. They could say, a Christian believer, for example, could accept that with regard to some particular feature, X, that science has removed the need for God. But you'll notice that by putting X in here, this is an argument form that can be applied in multiple cases, and this is the idea that science is progressively getting rid of God from more and more features of the world, and so we can replace X by the origin of the universe, we can replace it by the order in the universe, we can replace it by the fine-tuning of the physical parameters, we can replace it by religious belief, and as science explains all of these things, God is removed from each of them in turn, and ultimately you can see the cumulative force of the argument. How might we respond? Well, one thing that we might say is that there's no necessary conflict. Science doesn't disprove God. God isn't a scientific hypothesis. We might talk about the fact that the founders of modern science believed in God, and indeed that wasn't accidental. They were motivated by their belief in God. We might point to the fact that the history of science isn't one of ongoing conflict, as it's often portrayed to be. These points are all correct, it seems to me. However, they don't quite get at the heart of this explaining away argument, because the argument is not claiming that they are incompatible. It accepts that science doesn't disprove God in that logical sense. The point is that two beliefs can be compatible and yet still be in competition with each other in some sense. Now, as an aside, this is part of the work that we've been doing. This is a sort of ongoing component of it, some work that I'm doing in conjunction with Jonah Schupak, a philosopher at the University of Utah, on the nature of competition of hypotheses. So not just talking about the science-religion context, but more generally. Because I don't think there has been much analysis of what it means for two hypotheses to be in competition. Let me give you an example. The extinction of the dinosaurs. Various hypotheses have been offered to explain why the dinosaurs became extinct. The most popular one is that it was due to asteroid impact. Another prominent one is that it's due to massive volcanic activity. Now, these are generally considered as rivals. We put forward evidence that shows that one of them accounts for all the relevant evidence, and that's often taken as showing that that is the correct hypothesis and we can get rid of the rivals. But you'll notice that those two hypotheses are not incompatible. They could both be true. They could both have played a role. And so here we have compatible hypotheses which are generally understood as being nevertheless rivals. Now, actually, we've been looking at that and saying, are they really rivals? Some people who've been objecting to the asteroid impact hypothesis have been saying, well, actually, maybe we should be taking both of them into account. But that's a bit of an aside. Let's now turn to how we might go about applying Occam's razor. Or to put it another way, how we might determine whether two hypotheses are competing. It boils down to more or less the same thing. So suppose you go out in the morning and your car won't start. And an initial hypothesis that springs to mind is that there's a faulty starter motor. But quickly you think of perhaps a more obvious one, an alternative hypothesis that the battery's flat. Suppose furthermore that you then discover that the battery is indeed flat. Well, in that case, there's no longer any reason to think that you've also got a faulty starter motor. Now note they're not incompatible. I mean, you could be really unlucky, you could be having a really bad day, and you might have a faulty starter motor as well as a flat battery. But the point is, there's no reason to think that you have a faulty starter motor once you've discovered that the battery is flat. Why not? Well, it explains all the relevant evidence. There's no connection between the two hypotheses. We can apply Occam's razor. Now, one point that's very important to note here is that there is no direct connection between the two hypotheses. As far as I'm aware, and I have to admit that when it comes to car mechanics, that's not very far, but as far as I'm aware, having a faulty starter motor does not cause your battery to be flat, or vice versa. There's no connection between them. And so, before you go out in the morning, before you discover that your car won't start, a flat battery has no implications for the faulty starter motor. Those of you who are familiar with Bayesian reasoning will know what's going on here. That actually it's once we uncover the evidence that it induces this conflict between the hypotheses. Well, let's look at another example. Suppose that your friend is going to meet you after work. They're going to get the train and meet you at the station. You turn up at the station and your friend's not there. So the initial hypothesis is that your friend missed the train. Thinking about it a little bit more, you think of another hypothesis that your friend is being delayed at work. Now you'll note that I said another hypothesis. I didn't actually say alternative as it is on the screen. Why not? Well, it seems fairly obvious that those are not, it's not an alternative hypothesis. In fact, setting it out in this way doesn't quite capture what's going on. This is better. Your friend missed the train. That explains why they're absent. But it's the fact that they were delayed at work that explains why they missed the train. Okay? So once you discover that your friend has been delayed at work, you don't say, oh, well, I can forget about that missed train hypothesis. That clearly doesn't make sense. The two go together. There's no conflict whatsoever in this case. Occam's razor does not apply. Now, if you get nothing else from today's talk, let me make one really important point here, just from these two examples. You can't just simply apply Occam's razor anytime you want. You've got to look at the conditions for applying it. Is it appropriate to apply Occam's razor in a given context or not? And so that's what we've been working on. I've been working along with my colleague Mark McCartney at Ulster on the nature of explaining away as part of a project funded by the John Templeton Foundation over the last couple of years. And so what we've been trying to do is to address this question about the conditions for Occam's razor to apply, or to put it in other language, for the conditions for explaining away. So let's look very briefly at the general idea of the formal account of this. And as I mentioned earlier, it's based on Bayesian reasoning. So here we have the Reverend Thomas Bayes, to whom we owe this approach to probabilistic reasoning. So let's try to get the general idea. Over here we have the probability of the faulty starter motor. So whilst you're having your breakfast, before you go out to your car, if you ask, what's the probability that I've got a faulty starter motor? Well, it will, I hope, be very low. This will, of course, depend on what make of car you drive. It will depend on the age of the car and so forth. But I assume it will be very low. I hope it will actually be much closer to naught than it is on that diagram. However, once you go out to your car and it won't start, that changes things. Now the probability of the faulty starter motor, given that your car isn't starting, is much higher. Now it's not 1. You don't know for sure that it's a faulty starter motor. There could be other explanations, but it's much higher than it was to begin with. And now the key question is, what happens when we introduce the alternative hypothesis? Once we discover that in fact it was a flat battery, what happens to that probability? Does it go up? Does it go down? And if it goes down, the probability of the faulty starter motor, given that the car wasn't starting and that the battery is flat, if it goes down, we've got explaining away. Indeed, in this case, it will go right back down to where it was to begin with. And that is our Bayesian approach to explaining away. Now, there's all sorts of details and equations. If any of you want to look into that, I can provide you with details. But there's two limitations to this approach. One is, how would you go about applying Bayesian reasoning in science and religion? What exactly are the probabilities? How would we even begin to get a handle on those? And you might even question, is it the right way at all to go about thinking about explaining away in that context? So with those problems in mind then, what we've done is to look at how we can ask certain questions that will help us to determine in a given case whether explaining away occurs or not. And so these questions are as follows. Are the explanations compatible? And I'm going to assume that they are. If they're not, that makes everything trivial. Okay. Is the alternative explanation known to be true? How well does the alternative explanation account for the evidence on its own? And does one explanation depend on another? All of these are related to the Bayesian reasoning, but they're an informal way that can help us to answer the question more generally. Well, rather than explain the relevance of each of those questions, let me run through the two examples very briefly. Let's take the car example first of all. Are the explanations compatible? Yes, we're going to assume that, of course. Is the alternative explanation, the flat battery, known to be true? Well, yes, I'm assuming that. I'm assuming that you've discovered that it is indeed true that there is a flat battery. Now a really important question. How well does this alternative explanation, the flat battery, account for the evidence on its own? Well, very well. It's exactly what you'd expect, that your car wouldn't start if you had a flat battery. And does one explanation depend on the other? No. And so in answering those questions, we're able to see that it's appropriate to apply Occam's razor in this case. But now let's take the other scenario where your friend was getting the train. Are the explanations compatible? Of course. is the alternative known to be true? Well, yes, again, I'm assuming that you've discovered that your friend has indeed been delayed at work. Now we might ask, how well does the alternative explanation account for the evidence on its own? And here, not so well. Because if your friend had been delayed at work but had somehow managed to catch the train, well, in fact, they would have turned up. So the two explanations seem to go together in this case. And finally, and perhaps more importantly, does one explanation depend on the other? And as we saw, it certainly did. And so in this case, using our informal questions enables us to say that Occam's razor doesn't apply in this case. How might we go then about applying this in a science-religion context? Well, I'm going to use the same 4 questions. First of all, are the explanations compatible? Now, first of all, I'm going to assume in all cases that the answer is yes. I mean, of course, you can think of particular religious explanations that will be incompatible with scientific explanations. We can think of a young earth creationism that is incompatible with a scientific account of origins. In that case, explaining away is trivial. They're both just incompatible with each other. So I'm going to assume that we're talking about cases where they're not incompatible. Is the alternative explanation known to be true? Well, I'm going to say that will depend on which particular scenario we're talking about. How well does the alternative explanation account for the evidence on its own? Again, I'm going to suggest that will depend on the particular scenario. And lastly, does one explanation depend on the other? Now, when it comes to science and religion in general, I'm going to suggest that it's this last one that is the real Achilles heel for any explaining away argument. Now, here I'm moving into dangerous territory because the 2 topics that I'm about to look at are huge topics and I can't possibly do justice to them. What I want to do is just to show how they might relate to these questions so you get the idea of them. A multiverse and design. Does the hypothesis that our universe is only one of many, potentially infinitely many, universes, explain design away as an explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe? Well, our initial hypothesis, we'll say, is design, and the alternative is a multiverse. Are the explanations compatible? Yes, of course. There could be a designer and a multiverse. There doesn't seem to be any problem in principle with that at all. But now if we go to the second question, is the alternative explanation known to be true? Now, there are some people who think you shouldn't take multiverses seriously at all, that they should have no part in any kind of scientific way of thinking at all. Others take them much more seriously. My point, however, is that we don't know that a multiverse exists. It's possibly an interesting hypothesis, but it's speculative. At most, it's a possibility that's worth considering. And so, it's not known to be true. It's a possibility, at best. And here my key point would be that mere possibility of it being true is nowhere near good enough for explaining a way to occur. This just won't work. Now, we could go through the other questions, but here I think you get the idea that there's a real problem here. Not necessarily for multiverses. I'm not saying we should rule them out. I'm just saying that in terms of their ability to explain away, the scope is limited. Let's go to another one, evolution and design. So, the idea that evolution explains design away as an explanation for intelligent life. Well, again, our first 2 questions are trivial. Are they compatible? Yes, of course. There could be a designer who has used evolution in some way. Is it known to be true? Well, again, my point here is, of course, to say, is not to argue against evolution, but to say, granted the truth of evolution, does that explain away design as an explanation for intelligent life? So I want to turn to the 3rd and 4th questions. How well does the alternative explanation account for the evidence on its own? Now, if we phrase this, and we should, because it's based on probability, is how likely is it that intelligent life would come about given atheistic or unguided evolution? well, then there's a great discussion to be had. Okay? We can discuss all sorts of things. We can discuss the role that evolutionary convergence might have in this discussion. We can also discuss the role of highly contingent events. So, for example, had that asteroid or volcanic activity or whichever it was not made the dinosaurs extinct, would we be here? If certain things had changed in the history of life, if we rerun the tape of life, as is often talked about, how would things work out? Would intelligent life arise? And I think the answer to that question is far from obvious. Richard Dawkins even talks about major infusions of luck. The point here, of course, especially when I quote Richard Dawkins, is not to say that this poses a problem for evolution. That's not my point here at all. It's rather that it poses a problem for evolution's ability to explain away. And that's very different. When we come on to the final question, does evolution depend on design? Well, here I think the answer is arguably much clearer. Evolution requires an orderly universe. It depends on physical laws being in place. It requires a fine-tuned universe. It requires a suitable planet orbiting a suitable star, and so forth. I think there are good reasons to say that arguably it depends on design. So whilst this is very quick and sketchy, and you might arrive at different answers to my questions, hopefully you see the point that answering these questions enables us to address this question of explaining and explaining away. And so it's very important to make this distinction between evolution explains and evolution explains away, or more generally, that science explains and that science explains away. As I said earlier, once we look at science more generally, the idea that progress in science as a whole explains away God, then I think a key question is going to be the final one about whether science itself depends on design. But before coming to that, I want to look at some models of the relationship between science and religion, or in particular science and theism. Now it seems to me that anybody who wants to be taken seriously in terms of the interaction between science and religion has got to propose models of the relationship between science and religion. That seems like an essential component. There should be 4 of them. I have 4. One of them should be an independence model. This is an independence model. And there should be a conflict model in there as well, and you'll see that there is. So these models are intended to help us think about whether explaining away occurs. So this first one is indeed independence. So science is explaining features of the natural world, and theism is sitting out there all on its own with nothing to do with it. It's independent of science and the natural world. This is not, of course, to say that theism isn't important. It might be important for all sorts of other reasons. One approach that fits in very well with this is Stephen Jay Gould's non-overlapping magisteria, or NOMA, where theism is related to meaning and purpose and values, but not to accounting for the natural world. And suffice it to say, this solves the problem of explaining away. Explaining away cannot occur at all here because theism isn't in the business of explaining at all. This is one possibility. It's too easy. Okay, and it's also criticised as a model of science and religion. Many theists have criticised it as being just an inadequate model of the relationship between science and theism. So let's move on to, so no explaining away, but arguably it comes at a high price for theists. A second one, which I think is much more plausible and has a very long history, is that God acts in the world via scientific laws. So science does indeed account for the natural world, but science itself in turn depends on theism. And so we might say that God acts via science or via the scientific laws, or in other terminology, that God acts via secondary causes. And this, of course, was the response that Thomas Aquinas himself gave to this objection to the existence of God. Now you'll see that this looks very much like the train example earlier, where Occam's razor couldn't be applied. And that's no accident at all. This approach has excellent scope for avoiding explaining away, and it's also a plausible model. It does, however, require this dependence between theism and science. Third model, the indirect conflict model. The idea here is that both theism and science are offering potential explanations, and science, since it explains the natural world, it kind of makes theism redundant. Notice that the structure here, there's no dependence between science and theism. This is just like the car example, where we could apply Occam's razor earlier on. Needless to say, this offers the most scope for explaining away to occur. And not surprisingly, it seems that something like this model is simply assumed by the new atheists and others who would wish to apply an explaining away type argument. I think there are various problems with this model that many people have written about. And again, I would point in particular to science and theism. Now, this model doesn't guarantee explaining away, but it does make it quite likely to occur. And our final model is an interdependence model. So it has something in common with models 2 and 3, that still theism, you see the arrow going to science and then down to the natural world, so we still have this idea of God acting via secondary causes, but in addition to that there's an extra arrow. Now, the idea here is that God is not merely acting via secondary causes, but is in some way guiding natural processes to bring about desired outcomes. Now, how he's doing that is a huge topic. In fact, there's a whole area of science and religion study in terms of divine action, about how God acts in the world, that might try to spell out the details of that. Well, the point I simply want to make here is that here we have another very plausible model, and it too has plenty of scope to avoid explaining away. So summarising our models, we want to evaluate them in two respects. One in terms of just how good a model they are of the relationship between science and theism, and the other in terms of their scope for explaining away. The independence one is excellent in terms of avoiding explaining away. It just can't occur. But arguably it's a very poor model of the relationship between science and theism. The second one, that God acts via scientific laws, I think is a very plausible model and also has very good scope to avoid explaining away. Thirdly, the indirect conflict model, I think is a very weak model, again, of the relationship between science and theism. And it's also very weak at avoiding explaining away, or it has a lot of scope for explaining away. And finally, the interdependence model, again, like the second one, I would suggest is very plausible, and like it too, has very strong potential to avoid explaining away arguments. And so the point is, we just can't simply assume the indirect conflict model. We've got to say, well, which of these makes most sense? And so when we come to the new atheists, I think the argument is something like this: science explains. They then assume Occam's razor can be applied and therefore draw the conclusion that science explains God away. But what they're doing here, I think, is simply assuming this indirect conflict model. And I think this is very weak. They've at least got to give us very good arguments in support of this. And yet, I don't think they even try. Now, I did say that a lot of this, avoiding explaining away, hangs on this question about a dependence between science and theism. It's not the only aspect of it, but it is an important one. And here I just want to suggest that there's a whole variety of reasons for thinking that there is a dependence between the two. These are based on arguments from natural theology. For example, we might think about cosmological arguments based on the existence of the universe, or the beginning of the universe. We might think about design arguments based on the order in the universe, or the fine-tuning of the physical parameters. We might think about the comprehensibility and mathematical nature of the universe. All of these, I think, are very good pointers to the idea that science itself depends on theism. Now, you might say, but do these arguments work? Are they good arguments? Well, my point here is that they need to be shown to fail for explaining away to succeed. In other words, to show that the conditions for Occam's razor, or for explaining away, are satisfied, you need to show that these arguments fail. And this is a very tall order indeed. In fact, it seems to me that this really shows why explaining away arguments won't work. Remember the attraction of them. You could appeal to science and Occam's razor, and you didn't need to get bogged down in detailed philosophical discussions. I would claim that nothing could be further from the truth. If you want to show that explaining away occurs, you're going to have to deal with all these kinds of issues. This approach has been applied in various areas. As part of the project that I mentioned earlier with my colleague Mark McCartney, we've looked at science and theism in general, but others too have looked at this approach or a similar one. Rodney Holder, who's here today, has applied our approach to Big Bang cosmology and to fine-tuning arguments. Jonas Schuback, I mentioned him earlier as well. He has applied a slightly different approach, but again, in terms of explaining away arguments to evolution and design. I have looked at how this might apply in the context of cognitive science of religion, that as it explains the origin of religion, it somehow explains away religion itself. And finally, some work that's not related to science and religion on the nature of competing hypotheses in general. So in conclusion then, I would like to say that explaining away provides a framework for understanding and responding to these alleged conflicts. That indirect conflict model, I think, captures this ongoing perception of a conflict. It's not appealing to science and religion being incompatible, but to this explaining away mechanism. So I think it captures why people might think that there is a conflict. Also, I hope to have shown or persuaded you that it's not easy to explain God away. We can't move simply from science explains to science explains away. Those two things are completely different. And finally, we need to consider the conditions for Occam's razor if an explaining away argument is to be put forward. And unfortunately, that is usually not even attempted, never mind achieved. Just in conclusion, there are some details about the project that I referred to. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. We've got plenty of time for 10 minutes or so for questions. I can see hands going up already, so start over the far side over there, and then we'll work back across the room, I think.
So, thank you for sharing this very fresh and thoughtful approach to the question. You mentioned, of course, Thomas Bayes, and he wrote down the mathematical formula, which is the basis of Bayesian analysis. I'm curious whether you can turn these Occam's razor ideas. As you know, in statistics, there's this kind of really passionate disagreement between how to approach statistics between the Bayesians who advocate Bayesian analysis and the frequentists. And it all has to do with they agree in the mathematics, but of course, the way that they believe you should use mathematics to model data that you find in the real world, they differ on that. Yeah. And there's been, for example, there was a physics paper recently about comparing the approaches to the data that came from the Large Hadron Collider. Mm-hmm. Even though they get different numbers, they more or less come to the same conclusion that the Higgs boson was discovered. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious whether, turning this idea of Occam's razor not just to science and religion, but even just to a secular debate between philosophies of statisticians, whether that makes any sense.
Mm. Yeah, okay, thank you. First of all, you're right, of course, there are different viewpoints on the correct approach to probability and to statistics. I think the way that I would put it is that certainly when it comes to reasoning, when we're looking at reasoning and how we weigh up evidence, if we're going to approach this in terms of degrees of belief, I think a Bayesian approach has a lot of merits going for it. And the sort of approach that I'm talking about, where I first came across it actually, was in terms of the artificial intelligence literature. So Bayesian reasoning is used a lot in that context, and so explaining away has been applied in cases of medical diagnosis. So someone has symptoms and there are different explanations, and so this kind of reasoning becomes very important in medical diagnosis. And so Bayesianism is a very valuable tool in that context. So I think if we're going to look at it from a reasoning point of view, and so to try to capture at least this version of Occam's razor, I'm not claiming that this is the only version, this is a sort of explaining away version. I think it captures it quite well here. Whether it could be applied to that debate itself, I think, is an interesting one. I'm not sure about that. I think this idea of competing hypotheses, it certainly could be applied to that in science more generally, and we've done some work, as I mentioned, looking at that in the context of the extinction of the dinosaurs. But on the traditional statistical approaches versus Bayesianism itself, I'm not sure, but thank you.
There we go.
Thanks very much. I have a question regarding maybe going back one step to the question science explains.
Yes.
I come from a sort of area where there's a lot of skepticism as to whether science explains at all. So,
Okay.
for example, with your comment on Thomas Aquinas, where you have this idea that God was invoked to keep the planets moving, and now we no longer have that, where you've moved from saying, okay, speed is conserved, and now we say, well, and God was needed to push them, and now we say, well, energy is conserved, and that just happens.
Okay.
We don't need God to keep energy conserved because that's just what the universe does.
Okay.
And so, from the sort of the angle of scientists who say, well, science doesn't explain, it describes, and then you come down here and you say that's just what the universe does, and there is no further level of, there is no explanation possible.
Yeah.
Does your argument have anything to say to that kind of logic that says the universe is just a brute fact?
Well, I think what this amounts to is to say that theism shouldn't be brought in as an explanation at all, that it's not in the business of explanations. That is a different issue. I mean, I'm assuming, your point is a good one, and I'm assuming for the purposes of this talk that theism can be appealed to as an explanation of a kind. Now, I do want to stress, not as a scientific explanation. So it's not as if we're appealing to God as a scientific hypothesis of some sort. Rather, as Richard Swinburne would argue, that God is providing a personal explanation, and that can go alongside, I would say, with a scientific explanation. So I think we need to think about it in different ways, and I think that's important in a lot of these debates, because where explaining away does occur, and this is something I've omitted, so I thank you for the opportunity to clarify it, where I think it does occur is when we try to bring in God as a rival scientific explanation. Okay, and if that's the case, where there is a rival scientific explanation, then I think it is quite likely that explaining away could occur in those contexts. Various arguments can be put forward as to why God should or shouldn't be thought of in terms of a personal explanation. I think there are good reasons to think that God can be appealed to in that context, just as we appeal to other personal explanations. And ultimately, I suppose the way I would see it is that in terms of making sense of theism, or making a case for it, I would see it as a sort of inference to the best explanation, that if theism's true, it would make sense of more features of the universe. In other words, it would explain them. So that would be my sort of notion of explanation. But yes, there's certainly a lot more to be said about that point. Thank you.
Thank you. Move across the room. There's a hand just here.
Thank you very much. I have three withering criticisms of what you've presented.
You have to be quick with three.
of increasing profundity and importance, but as I need to be quick, let me just give you the first one, whose consequence is simply that it may end up to the permanent disfiguring of my son. I have a car outside my house. It's a camper van. It has a flat battery. This is true, I kid you not. On Saturday we were going to get it going because we wanted to use it to go away for the weekend. It has a flat battery. You've told us we have an alternative hypothesis. One is, the observation is the lights don't work and the engine, when you turn the key, nothing happens. You've told us that we have alternative hypotheses. It could be the battery, or it could be the starter motor. Forget we haven't looked at the lights, we've just seen the motor.
Sure.
These are alternative hypotheses. I say to my son, starter motors are complicated things, but batteries are easy.
Yeah.
get a battery, get the spanners out, get a new battery, put it in, and turn the key. He does that, and the battery blows up in his face, and he has acid all over his face. Now, the reason that happened was that you told him that these were alternative hypotheses. Therefore, if changing the battery and making it, if the battery was the problem and you replace the battery, then everything is fine. They're not alternative hypotheses. If there was a major short in the starter motor, then putting a new full powered battery in there means that he's going to be shoving 16 volts, lots of amps, not many volts, through something with tiny resistance, which is going to release a lot of energy, which is going to boil the battery oil, and it'll blow up in his face. Now, the reason for that is that you said you have chosen Bayesian, or you said it is an alternative hypothesis, rather than it is a different hypothesis. You've also said it's Bayesian, that the options are or, and, or not. It may not be Bayesian, it may be quantized, it may be both or and. The mere statement from the outset that it is Bayesian and that these are alternatives means that I cannot say to my son, go and change the battery, because I cannot know. Well, you would advise me to let him change the battery because it's Bayesian and it's alternative, whereas actually, though you had no grounds for saying either of those, and you have endangered my son's future marriage prospects and my entire estate, one generation down, may be left to the crown.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to that?
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah. Well, I certainly am not recommending that course of action for your son. Indeed, I wasn't recommending any course of action at all. How we should go about evaluating these hypotheses and trying to determine whether one is true or not is another question entirely. We might think of this as a difference between Bayesian decision making and Bayesian reasoning, and how we might use Bayesianism in a context of helping us to decide what to do. Now, I haven't commented on that at all. I've only commented on it in terms of reasoning. In this case, what I'm looking at is a particular piece of evidence. And again, a little bit like the previous point, your question enables me to make a further comment which I didn't touch upon. And it is simply this, that whether two hypotheses are alternatives, whether they're competing or whether explaining away occurs, depends on the evidence in question. So it could well be that there is further evidence that they're competing with respect to one piece of evidence, but not competing with respect to another. And so I quite take your point that if we include more evidence, they may well not be competing after all. So that's an entirely reasonable point, I think, to make. The idea that Bayesian reasoning doesn't apply, well, I think when we look at the formalism of Bayesian reasoning, it allows for a lot of scope between the extremes of and or here. And again, I'm not assuming that. Of course, in the simplest case, this works if the flat battery guarantees the evidence or the other guarantees the evidence. But in realistic cases, of course, that may not be. It may make it quite likely that the car won't start or whatever. So there's much more to be said, and indeed in the Bayesian reasoning that I referred to in terms of artificial intelligence, people have looked at a lot of these questions about how different hypotheses interact and how different evidence can change the nature of the picture.
Thank you, Robert. There.
Hi there. I have a question about burden of proof.
Yeah.
So I think you made the case that you seem to favor this interdependence model by which a God could influence observations of data, of natural phenomena.
Yeah.
And I think one of your sort of points so as to render this acceptable to a crowd like this, or indeed a larger crowd, was that a new atheist, for example, would have to disprove fine-tuning, if I remember correctly from your slide. And I wonder, this is kind of a recurring theme, so that perhaps the new atheist response would be, no, I don't have to disprove fine-tuning to say that virgins don't give birth. The burden of proof, just to take one random example, the burden of proof would be on your shoulders as a theist, not to talk about fine-tuning, but rather to look at specific claims of miracles and say this can happen. Is that clear? So
Sure.
to recapitulate the burden of proof question,
Yeah.
it seems to me to be shifted here.
Okay.
You're saying I can have my miracles and all I need
Oh.
is your ambiguity about fine tuning,
Okay.
whereas I think in actuality the new atheist would say no, we don't have to worry about fine tuning or we don't have to talk about that, but rather you have to demonstrate to me how it is possible, given what we know about nature, that a virgin can give birth. Just to
Yeah.
pick an example.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I haven't said anything about miracles. That's another huge topic. My argument here is not that
deity could influence natural phenomena. I think that was the interdependence model. Is that right?
Oh, but that doesn't require miracles. I mean, I'm not trying to settle the issue on that. This is a huge topic, and there'll be many people in the audience probably who can say much more about this. There's a lot of people who have done work on sort of what's called special divine action, about how God might act in the world without acting in a miraculous way. So, no, I'm not claiming that if God is guiding the processes, that that's by way of miraculous acts that he's doing. And secondly, I wasn't, that was one option, that model. I also looked at the other one in terms of secondary causes. So both could be considered. And again, I would just say that what I'm talking about is theism here. So I'm not saying that, given the difficulties with these explaining away arguments, that just means you can accept everything about Christian theism. I've been looking just at the question of theism itself. I suppose as one final point on that, I would say that when it comes to something like miracles, now there's all sorts of other aspects to that kind of debate, but one of the things I've looked into a little bit is how some of this sort of explaining away type approach might be used in that context as well. Okay.
Thank you. I think we'll draw our questions to a close at that point, and we'll gather then those who want to for further discussion around the frontier fairly quickly afterwards. We've been treated to a very clear explanation of explaining away. And thank you very much, David, for taking us through this afternoon. Can you join me in thanking you?